So my topic is a little different from the traditional topics that we have addressed. But I see over the years that we have come back to this topic consistently, and I see that there are other familiar speakers also on related themes. So I'm glad that we are talking about this because it's important and we need to keep updated with science as it moves along. So I'm going to talk about data science generically in medicine and a little bit in hematology diagnosis. And I'd like to thank the organizers of Mindray Cube, Aspire 2021, Dr. Anil Handu as a medical consultant, also for this group, for this meeting. I'm truly grateful. I have no conflict of interest to declare. And where I use brand names like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft, it is only to demonstrate an issue, and it is not really endorsement of a particular product. I wonder how many of you have watched Star Trek. It has its own fan club and its own fan gathering and groups. But I was just thinking back when I was going to talk about AI in the medical domain, and I was thinking of the TRICODER, which was used by Dr. I think his name is Dr. McCoy. This was the earlier versions which came out in the first few years of Star Trek. And then subsequently it became more high-tech. If you can see the scanning going on over there, that little device has a screen and it's actually doing what looks like a complete MR on a little handheld device. Well, we certainly have not reached there, I think. But when one thinks about artificial intelligence and where technology is going, I think we need to keep some realities in mind, but we also need to aspire for what may be the future. And especially speaking in a week after two persons have gone to the edge of space and come back in a matter of 10 minutes, or for a matter of 10 minutes, and spend millions of dollars on that. I think things that we need to discuss are not out of reach, but we need to have a sustained, systematic approach. They didn't reach space by starting day before yesterday. And those are all results of efforts and huge investments over a decade or more. These are common buzzwords that we use, that we hear very commonly: artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, data warehouses, data clouds. Then it's went down to data lake, data ponds. Somehow the affinity for geography and geological terms seem to be increasing. If you just do a simple search with artificial intelligence, you'll see thousands of papers, and you can see the gradual increase in the trend, especially over the last decade. There are a large number of papers which have come out about this subject. So the broader entity would be data science, and then there are subsets that we will talk about within it, which may be of more interest to us and more familiar names and terms to us. So data science is defined in one way as a data-centered activity dedicated to the principled extraction of knowledge from complex data with the aim of generating further insights. And this is from a paper which came out, the first definition is from an earlier paper, which is there in Chronic Kidney Diseases and Translational Medicine Journal. And the second definition is from the IBM website, from their cloud data management site, which talks about a multidisciplinary approach to extracting actionable insights from large volumes of data. And their perspective is generic. For us, we will have to then kind of put some boundaries around it and talk about medical information specifically. So generally what is involved, and I'll come back to these points subsequently also, there is data preparation and data processing. When you do analysis, which is not a simple mean, median, standard deviation and a distribution chart, but there's going to be more detailed analysis of this. Beyond analysis, there is visualization. because it's one thing to analyze the data and it's another thing to visualize the data and to understand and to make it comprehensive to human beings who are going to view it. The purpose is important because it is to enable the stakeholders who are different in different situations. It might be a patient, it might be a caregiver, it might be a researcher, an administrator, or a policy maker, and different people need to be able to extract information from this. And it is important to remember that it is purposive versus random. Sometimes when we think of big data, we think of huge volumes of data and just allowing a computer to trawl it and find actionable information. And usually that is not the case. And it is important, later also I'll emphasize this again, to not forget the framework that we have traditionally used. The creation of a research hypothesis, asking a question and creating a research hypothesis is as important today as it was with our traditional methods. Artificial intelligence is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines, and with a specific emphasis on intelligent computer programs. And if you see the date on this, this was defined way back in 2004. And I think there is another definition which Turing gives, which I will cite in a little while later. It is also related to the task of using computers to understand human intelligence. But this is McCarthy has a very broad approach to this and says that intelligence is not necessarily only biological, and therefore we should not constrain ourselves to biological intelligence. This is from the bottom. This little definition over here comes from a BJH paper which came out earlier this year, which says that these are computational programs that simulate and mimic human intelligence, such as problem solving and learning. And in a very generic sense applied to medical domain, I think this is a reasonable definition to go. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, neural networks, and deep learning are used very casually. Each one has its own definitions, but I won't go into the details of that. Machine learning is a subfield. Each of these it's like that Russian Matrushka dolls. You open one and the next one pops up inside of it. And so each of these are subsets or a subfield of the other. They are all related, and neural networks is the background of learning algorithms. And when you have multiple layers or levels of neural networks, then you can call it a deep learning algorithm. So they are different entities. They cannot be used interchangeably, and we should know what we are speaking about when we are using those terms. So how is it different from traditional software programming and analysis? Traditionally, we've done statistics. We've done very basic statistics, and statistical methods have evolved. There are various models. There are regression models and other models which can be used. It is not that statistics is not used in AI. Choosing the right statistical model is also important, and AI incorporates statistics as well as other analytic methods. And rather than being very mechanistic or deterministic, the AI software's major differentiation is that it learns as it goes along, and it potentially allows real-world experience to influence its decision making. So this, at a very high level, it involves learning of what the problem is, what the solution is by the software algorithm. And there are different types of learning, and these are three large categories. The traditional ones are the supervised and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is where you have labeled data and you tell the system what is your output that you require. Then you use the training set to train the system, and then you provide the unknown set to the machine to predict what is going to come out based on what is the first label set that you use. Unsupervised learning is to just provide raw data to the computer and expect the computer to identify patterns or groupings. And there are studies which have come, and later I will list some of the developments which have happened in the hematology domain using these different techniques. Reinforcement learning is a newer area, it is a kind of a hybrid of both supervised and unsupervised, where data is given, you look for patterns, and then you reward a positive result and you give a disincentive for the negative result. And then you allow iterations of this to run so that you can improve your the machine that you have created. It is very important for us to think about the clinical merit of the question. And that's why I was also emphasizing again, computers can't do this in isolation. Without the human being asking the question and without there being clinical merit to the data which is, to the question which is asked and to the answer which is given, it is just garbage in and garbage out. The second important thing about machine learning, and I will again talk about this later, is to be able to generalize to populations which are not involved in the development process. Now, as far as hematology is concerned, morphologically cells look similar, so this issue might not arise for us when we are looking at our own specific domain. But when we are involving population-based studies and predictive studies and outcome studies, then we should also understand that different populations have different population characteristics, and we should make sure that bias and the initial data set, the data set that is used, what the effect is on the result which is coming. Now, all these systems are what is known as data hungry, which means we need large volumes of data in order to make sense and create these kind of systems. It is not enough to have few hundred cases and then start off from there. But that is a starting point. That is not to dissuade people who are collecting data, and I will emphasize the importance of data also a little. Now, this label of AI has become very ubiquitous, and often we see this as a kind of term which is available on so many products, AI or AI driven or AI inside. These are kind of terms which have come along very commonly nowadays. So what does this involve? The thing is that because of the different ways of evolving computing, there is a spectrum to this, and where there is a high level of human intervention, which is where we have to decide what the independent variables are, which are the dependent variables, what is the weightage assigned to each of these variables in the model that we create, that would become a low level AI model. If you want to call it an AI model, you might stop at saying this is an algorithm which is useful for this. Whereas if you have a low level of human intervention and more computing which is going to analyze the data and give us the model which is created from raw data, then that has a very high level of or a high AI proportion, and you can call it as a high level AI tool. So I've given some examples over there. There is an example of a prognostic score for myelofibrosis, for mortality of patients in myelofibrosis, and this is a traditional regression-based tool which is developed. There are a number of parameters which are given. You enter all those parameters into a grid. It will assign it. It will run it on the model and then give you the prognostic score on it. But this is a very traditional statistical model. Whereas a retinal image analysis, and this I'm just using this as an example, where deep learning has been used to identify diabetic retinopathy in images from the retinal fundus. There are products which are apparently even better than direct human interventions, and it has been proven, and there are publications to this effect. It is a matter of how well the system is developed and how well the system is trained. Various languages which are used, Python is now becoming more popular, and it is a language which is useful for AI. R is a statistical software. It is a free software, so those who do not have SPSS or Stata often use R. It requires some basic level of programming beyond the traditional drop and click or GUI interface, so people find it more challenging sometimes. MATLAB or Scilab. There are many other platforms. I just mentioned a few which I know of. Also, the computing premises have changed. Some devices, some of these algorithms can be run on laptops. The computing has become so efficient, and our laptops have become so powerful now. In some situations where you're going to use large data sets and require more computing, You can use commercial public clouds like what Amazon Web Services provide or Microsoft Azure Network Services provide. And these can be set up if you have the resources in a day or two, or even less than that, based on what you require and how much of computing power is required. And so the access to computing is not out of the reach, and the whole cloud-based computing scenario has brought this also within our reach for us. In the medical domain, some 10 years ago, the largest proportion of digital data was from the diagnostic domain. It was lab imaging, which provided a lot of the digital data in the system. Over the last 5-10 years, I think more devices have come into play, which have become digital. More devices are digital and interfaced with the EMR. And so you have various different types of monitors, which are invasive and non-invasive, which are providing continuous readouts. It might be the ICU monitor, it might be a labor room cardiofetal topogram, which is attached to the mother's abdomen and is continuously monitoring, and it's not producing paper printouts. Currently in a labor room, we have a system which provides digital outputs from the system. And all of these are providing large amounts of data which have one level of interpretation which is available now, but can potentially be leveraged for other things. Multi-omics, there are so many types of proteomics and genomics and other new omics which are coming out over the last, especially over the last decade, and all these provide large volumes of data. EMRs have developed and more data is being digitized. We have one nationwide standard which is available, which the Ministry of Health has published, and a lot of it is natural language, but a lot of it is also becoming structured, and so there are opportunities there. Nursing EMRs are also being developed, and also the basic identity management, demographic coding data which comes from the admission, discharge, and transfer systems, which is the core of many of the EMRs. And there are other systems which I have not mentioned over here, which are also available, which might be specialized in specific departments like radiomics, radiation therapy, etc. So the important thing to know is that it begins with identification of a problem. There is no such thing as here is all the data, go and find something new. Unsupervised learning is not yet quite mature, it's not ready yet. So we have to start with asking a question, and that's important. Data preparation, understanding the data and preparing the data is really grunt work, but without good quality of data, it really does not work. And although many of us think we have a lot of digital data sitting around, unless it is annotated and it's clean, it will not work with intelligent systems. Data modeling, there are various systems, and if you do a quick search for data modeling or algorithm, it appears as if they are all now available easy and off the shelf. However, there is a science involved, and we should be choosing the right algorithm for the right application. And even those which are available off the shelf need to be customized. Then there is an issue of training the algorithms to recognize what you're looking for, evaluation, and then that involves testing and validation, and then finally implementation. In hematology, generally there are clinical or lab areas, and the silos we know are fast becoming, the borders between these silos are fading very quickly, and there is a lot of crossover in these areas. And so broadly, clinical may be outcome of diagnostic applications, and in the lab we're looking at diagnostic applications, prognostic, and looking at how these tools can help augment our workflow and take away mundane tasks. So the traditional approach in how we would develop the software is for the user to think about what the problem is and do some literature search and come up with an idea. Then you go to the programmer and say, this is what I want, and have the programmer develop. And the programmer would create the code, implement the application, and hopefully we will obtain an answer. And sometimes it takes iterative versions to do it. And this in contrast to deep learning, has now become called, this is now called as shallow learning. But believe me, there's nothing shallow about it. It takes a lot of insight and knowledge to do. So in this, there are, I'm just taking the example of digital pathology imaging. The first thing is to segment objects from the background. When you extract distinctive features either by manual system or by automated system subsequently, and then you classify these objects based on a classifier that you did. Now, if you do it really well and your problem is very narrowly defined, you can have good performance. However, it starts off with segmentation accuracy and effectiveness of feature extraction. So unless you have those well defined and well tested, you will have problems with the product which comes out. And every step is important. So if you don't have a good smear or a good image of a smear, then everything downstream will become a problem. And believe me, every aspect of a smear then counts for us. The thickness of a smear, the area of a smear, the region where the cells are present, how thick the smear is, how much of overlapping cells are there. It is hard to teach a computer to differentiate between two overlapping red cells and a white cell. So all these need to be addressed. Otherwise, you'll end up with false negatives or false positives. In machine learning and with AI, there are different ways of looking at it. And these are some of the studies which have come out in the last, these are from 2015 to 2020 publications, which are easily available to search in PubMed, and you can see it. Some are for outcome prediction and some are for diagnosis. And you will see that I put in brackets what are the data contributors to this, or what are the source data based on which these algorithms are defined. And you can see that various parameters have been used by different groups of people. Essentially, the silos need to be broken down and we need to work together as teams trying to find answers to this. So in essence, in the short term, and I quote this from a paper which came out from the National Academy of Medicine, which is in the US, so otherwise known as the Institute of Medicine. Now they call it as the National Academy of Medicine. Their belief is that we are not ready for fully autonomous agents yet. We are probably good for augmented intelligence at this point in time. We have to develop user trust, and especially when machines are involved, the blame game will start very early. So it should be clear to the end user as to what is machine generated and what is human generated, and what is the oversight of machine results by the human being. And an example I can talk about is the autonomous cars which have been tested. And whenever there is a crash, then we always hear about it very easily and very quickly, because people are sensitive to these kind of issues. And so we should be careful when we bring it in, because finally we should remember, as the earlier speaker also, as Dr. Kodaji was saying, finally there is a human being at the end of this, and we should be conscious of that. There are concerns in biases in data sets used for model development, and because the computer will not be able to exclude bias unless the investigator is aware of this, and using AI in developing non-representative populations. And I talked about this earlier also. We also have to think about other unintended effects on patient-client relationship and care. And we have to be careful about this. Some of these we might not be aware of, and unless we are looking out for this, we might not find it. There is actually very limited data on actual effects on patient outcomes. So we are in the process of waiting for this kind of information to come out. And of course, everything is driven by economies, and the cost on the impact on cost of care should also be factored in. Finally, it might be a click and use, but the development of these tools might be more expensive than we set out and we think. What are the challenges? Primarily, I think any group which is developing this, startups or interest groups which are developing, will bemoan the lack of data. The data sits within hospital walls, and within hospital walls, within silos. And so we need to start working and seeing how we can externalize this data, creating clean data sets for ground truth, which is used for training and testing, and then for validation sets. Larger the data set, the better the reliability of the machine learning. Annotated data sets are important. There's no use in just giving a whole load of total count and differential count of biochemical values without having a diagnosis attached to it or a clinical relevance attached to it. We cannot actually help create information. The importance of metadata can't be underestimated. It is data about the data. When was it captured? On what platform was the test done? What was the date and time? What was the time of collection? What type of sample? All those things will become important. Otherwise, we'll end up with inaccurate or wrong artificial intelligence results. There are other concerns which are at a higher level, talking about transparency of AI tools, because many of these are patented and developed by startups and companies. It is not the traditional model. If you take a hematology analyzer or a coagulation analyzer, we completely understand what the principle is, we can troubleshoot it, and we know what is happening. It has been a translation of a manual method into automation. But with these kind of systems, they are virtually a black box. So how we look at these and how do we understand the results which come out of these, and how do we then bring about regulatory mechanisms and who takes ownership for these, all those are important questions that we need to think about as we go forward. There is currently no regulatory framework. HIPAA and GDPR have aspects which relate to data itself, but not really to how to address AI and development of AI. At national level in our country, we have some IT laws, but the data protection law, the personal data protection law is still in the making and has not become an act. And so therefore, we need to be careful when we take data and use data, both for research as well as for patient care. And then there are institutional level issues that we need to address and put into place, frameworks which include policy, processes, how do you manage data, how do you ensure anonymization, delinking, security of the person as well as the data. WHO has a view on this, and WHO has brought out some publications over the last year. And actually yesterday there was a talk by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan on the ethics, the role of ethics and the need for ethical approach to AI development. And we need to keep that in mind, and we need to address these issues also. Last couple of slides, teams are important, and it is no longer inward looking. Earlier we used to have the medical doctor and the diagnostician who would look at creating knowledge and information. Now we need to go beyond that. We need computer scientists, we need programmers, we need systems managers. We need to create a research framework that is up to date. And this came up yesterday again, because traditional research IRBs need to have capacity built as to ask the right questions and to be supportive of research projects which come up in the quest for AI. And the silos between clinical data and research data, and then maintaining permissions and allowing patients to withdraw their data from research databases. All those things become important issues. Of course, we need administrators to deal with all these issues. So where do we go from here? There are many areas that are waiting. I will not harp on each one of these. There are many areas which are available. We are sitting with data, and I think we should look at partnering with educational and other organizations which are academic organizations and other organizations which are involved in developing AI. And without this partnership, it's not going to go forward. However, we should not forget all the issues of accountability, access, and autonomy. And the WHO documents actually emphasize these, and they're actually creating checklists to help national regulatory organizations to build laws and regulatory status and audit. And not to forget that finally, our focal point is to improve patient care. And if it does not really improve patient care, we need to think about it carefully. And that's one of my favorite cartoons from Dilbert, who talks about the coffee machine with AI involved and incorporated. And I'd like to thank many people. There is a team that we are developing, which is cross-disciplinary, which involves clinicians, data scientists, and IT teams. And I'm grateful to each one of them for their contribution to this. We're also partnering with organizations within the country and outside the country. And we hope that we'll be able to set up an informatics core in the coming year, which will help us to move forward in a systematic manner. Thank you to the organizers of this meeting, once again to Mindray for the invitation to speak at this meeting. Thank you all for your patience.
Thank you, sir, for such a wonderful talk. There are some questions which you can answer. Uh, the first question is, could you please let us know how we can correspond with programmers as doctors in order to come up with some good systems, be it in the field of AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning?
Okay. I'm not sure whether that's a trick question. I think that's the hardest part actually. There is really no easy answer to that. But I would like you to think about it in not to discard, I talked about earlier, not to discard the idea of a hypothesis. Framing a question and asking a question and developing a research hypothesis still remains a basis on which you can interact with the IT people. Now, of course, IT people speak a different language, but I think today many of our clinicians and the group that I see on this meeting, I don't think anyone is really retrograde about communicating with computer scientists. So it takes some time and takes some effort. And it all starts with writing up at least one initial proposal, write a small study, write an observational study, talk to the computer scientists who are available close to you, liaise with academic organizations. There are, if you do PubMed searches and restrict the search to India, there are large number of publications which come out of India even now, and there are scientists who are willing to reach out and speak to you. I know that there is a lot of interest from mainly from the Ministry of Electronics and IT, and there is funding available within the country also. So somebody has to take the first step, and I would rather that we get out of our comfort zones and start talking to people outside. I'll stop over there.
One more question, sir, if you allow.
Go ahead.
There's a question, sample integrity and availability of only processed data through analyzers are the major hurdles for AI. What are your views?
I really do not the major hurdles for AI. Actually, I don't see it as a hurdle for AI. Every sample that we process through one of our cell counters, and I think over the last 10 years and a series of workshops on hemocytomorphometry, if I may quote Dr. Sukesh, I think has enlarged our views. Now we are all not looking only at the output of a cell counter in terms of what is the total count and the differential count. We are looking at the raw data, we're looking at BCS parameters, and I use BCS very broadly. We're looking at research data parameters which come out from the analyzers, and that is going to be a source of immense amount of data. So I don't think any of us are starved for data, and that is really not a hurdle for AI. The constraint is that we should understand that each platform has its own limitations and its particular way of addressing parameters. So when you generalize your interpretations, you should be careful. But for the system that you have, if you have a Mindray system or if you have a Sysmic system, then the data which comes out from it should be extracted, should be annotated, and linked back to the results that you have interpreted from looking at the peripheral blood or your knowledge of the clinical scenario around the patient. And that becomes your database from which you start.